This is part 3 of the lecture on questionnaires and questions. The design of questionnaires is more art than science, and the best way to learn to design questionnaires is through experience. But there are a number of guidelines that I can offer. One is the number of questions, and in general, of course, fewer questions is better in terms of getting a high response rate and getting accurate data and getting completed questionnaires. But of course, the trade-off is less information from fewer questions. In general, the number of questions should result in a time, and between 15 and 30 minutes is about what you can expect most people to willingly provide you. Maybe more on a mail survey or an internet survey that they can come back to. The sequencing of questions, my preference is to go from general to specific, with the exception of the introduction. In the introduction, I like to include a couple of easy, interesting questions to get people engaged with the research. But generally starting with evaluative questions, which are more general, and then moving on to diagnostic questions, which are beliefs or specific behavior questions, and then ending up with classification or demographic questions, simply because some of those demographics, questions about age, sometimes marital status, and certainly income or wealth, can be a little touchy for some people, and it's better to have collected some data and have them refuse to answer those than it is to have them refuse to answer them initially and perhaps simply reject the questionnaire at that point. The ordering of questions is the biggest art, I think, in questionnaire design after the design of specific questions. Researchers have to be aware that there can be a potential order bias. Recall in talking about experimental designs, there was a concern about testing effects, where one measurement affected another measurement. And that's true on specific surveys as well. I just suggested that the questions should be ordered such that evaluative questions come before diagnostic questions. But one critical exception to that is attitudinal questions about a brand and awareness questions about a brand. So a researcher could well be interested in the brand awareness level for a product and also would like to get a measure of brand attitude for that product. But certainly if you ask people their attitudes toward a specific brand, then you cannot later ask them if they're aware of that brand, because of course they're aware of it, they just answered a question about it. And unfortunately, researchers often run into the case where an A-B ordering is problematic because responding to A influences or biases a response to B, but the reverse is also true. The response to B might affect the response to A. So in that case, what the researcher needs to do is either come up with alternative forms of asking the question that would be less problematic, or sometimes split the sample and ask half the sample one of the questions and half the other question. Sometimes researchers will resort to pushing the questions very far apart in the hopes that the bias is diminished by the intervening activity. Screening questions and pivot questions help to design the questionnaire. A screening question assures that the respondent belongs in the sample and typically leads to an exit if the person doesn't belong in the sample. A pivot question moves people around in the questionnaire, moves them to a different set of questions. And a common example of a pivot question is to assure that people have the experience or the knowledge to answer a set of belief and behavior questions. So for example, a question might be, have you ever shopped at Whole Foods grocery store? And that would precede a set of questions measuring beliefs and attitudes toward Whole Foods. And if the person has not, then the pivot question moves them to maybe to another store, QFC or Safeway. So the aim there is to try to prevent people from responding to questions when they don't have the proper background or knowledge to do so. To get good design, it's crucial to pretest. So the emphasis here, red font, pretest, pretest, pretest. Pretest to assure the clarity of questions, pretest to assure the completeness of the response scales, that all the options are included. And then these three issues here, pretest to allow for pre-coding. So pre-coding is assuring that you have the right values that coders will then input into the data set. So that a 4 as marked on the questionnaire is indeed a 4 going into the data set. Recall that I said that no opinion option is going to be coded with a number. So on a 5-point scale, the no opinion response might be coded as a 6. You need to decide whether you're going to include that as a 6 in the data set or you're going to translate that into something else. Now you can put it in as a 6 so long as you're aware of it and you can deal with it later. Pre-column means that it refers to which column those data points are going to be put in. Ordinarily, the data are entered in a data matrix where the rows are all the responses from a given individual. So the first row is all the answers given by the first respondent, and the second row is all the answers for the second respondent. And then the columns correspond to items in the questionnaire or the variables themselves. And so a pretest assures that there's going to be the proper correspondence between what's on the questionnaire itself and what goes into the data set. And dummy tables, recall, are important tools for the researcher to develop before the data, before the research is designed. So a dummy table includes the measures, the variables, and the expected or potential hypothetical responses. So dummy tables here, a researcher can look at the dummy table and look at the questionnaires that are completed in the pretest and assure himself that indeed the variables that are analyzed in the dummy table are indeed available in the questionnaire. Some more guides to designing questionnaires. I mentioned the introduction. The introduction should be a bit of text on the first page of the questionnaire that explains the purpose of the questionnaire. It's important that that language be designed for the respondent. It's not designed for another researcher. It's not designed for management who's going to use the results of the questionnaire. It's simply a simple, straightforward explanation of why the survey is being conducted. It's usually enough to say we're interested in people's attitudes toward this product category, whatever it is. That introduction should also assure the respondent of anonymity, assuming that respondent will be anonymous, and explain why perhaps certain measures are being taken, things like income and so on. I mentioned that as part of that introduction, I would include the first couple of questions, although they're not designated as separate questions. But I like to make the first couple of questions easy and interesting, even if they're not measuring things that are important to the research. Organizing the The survey instrument is important. The questionnaire should look clean. A lot of emphasis on the number of questions, keeping the questionnaire short to encourage participation, but that shouldn't translate into minimizing the number of pages if it's a printed questionnaire or an internet questionnaire. So use space, separate sections clearly, separate questions so that there's, you want to minimize the opportunity for people to get confused. Use color coding the same way. You might have different font for different sections, or use bold font for instructions or something. Be sure to number the questions. That allows the respondent to keep his place as he moves through, and it allows the questionnaire to refer to other questions, for example, using pivot questions. And don't split questions. One of the worst mistakes to make is to have a question at the bottom of the page and the scale that follows that question on the next page. So when designing the questionnaire, of course, you want to look at the individual questions to check for overlap or gaps in responses. So overlap is having the same value in two options, and gaps would be having consecutive options on a scale that don't include some data points. Those are most problematic in measures of income and age and so on. As I said before, use familiar natural language. Keep it simple. Avoid loaded language. Questions that ask about dislikes or negatives may imply that there is something to dislike or something to be negative about, when in fact there's not. Avoid double-barreled questions. These are combinations of questions. Just be careful anytime you're using an and construction, no matter how much a company likes to talk about itself as having fast and courteous service. Those are two separate issues, and the researcher should try to keep them separate. When measuring beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes, the researcher needs to be careful about the level of specificity. In the theory of reasoned action, is this presumption that attitudes should be good predictors of behavior, because people do perform behaviors based on their evaluation of the alternatives. But that assumes that both the attitude and the behavior are measured at the same level of specificity or the same level of generality. So, for example, the question, how much do you enjoy eating at fast food restaurants, is a more general question than the question, how much do you enjoy eating at fast food burger chains? And if one were trying to predict purchases at Kid Valley or Dick's Drive-In, the fast food burger chain might be the more appropriate question. And next, be aware of the relevance of the issue. One of the reasons for pivot questions is to prevent people from responding to questions when they don't have the appropriate knowledge or experience, because people will respond to questions on the questionnaire even though they don't know the answers, and there's no way for the researcher to know that. So the first check, of course, is to sample properly so that only people who should be able to answer the questions are included in the sample. And a second is through pre-testing to determine whether there are people who don't know the answer to some of the questions, and in that case to provide them with an option to say, I don't know.